Welcome back to Shore Action's audio-visual series of the Pulsar Installation Manual. The previous segment gave you ideas about sensor placement for home automation systems. This segment will explain the best method for mixing the epoxy and the bottom mounting technique for the Pulsar. The most important part of the installation is how you deal with the epoxy. Even more crucial than choosing the right pulsar is mixing the epoxy and mounting the sensor correctly. Even the wrong sensor may work if you have a good epoxy bond. The epoxy is a double bubble pack, which means the resin and the hardener are contained separately within the pack. The epoxy should be about 70 degrees Fahrenheit when mixing. Putting the packs in your pocket before use will keep them at a good working temperature. Years ago, the epoxy was a liquid. You had to use drop cloths, hand cleaner, and maybe even cut your hair afterwards. Needless to say, mounting sensors could be challenging. The epoxy used today is a thick, non-sag formula, making installation neat and easy. The most common method of installation is the bottom mount. This refers to placing the sensor on the bottom edge of the joist. This position offers the highest level of sensitivity and can be used on all joist types when the joists are to be left exposed. If installing on an open web steel truss or a parallel cord wood truss, the pulsar should always be mounted at the base of the V. If drywall is going to be installed, you will side mount the sensors as shown in the next segment of this series. Since the pulsar is not limited to residential and commercial applications, you may occasionally have to mount sensors to materials that have a narrow mounting surface. These could include things like rounded steel bars and pipes. One or both of the sensor's tabs can be removed to provide a better fit. This, too, is shown in the next segment of this series. Shown here are all the possible tools you may need for a successful installation. We have a short piece of poplar to simulate a joist, a pulsar, in this case a high-performance pulsar as identified by two white wires, gel-filled crimps, a mixing stick, an epoxy pack, a pair of cutters, a means of opening the epoxy, and a heat gun. The only time a heat gun is required is when you must first warm cold steel before mounting the sensor in an unheated environment. Start by folding the epoxy pack in half. Snip off the end and squeeze both halves out onto a non-porous surface. Each half is a different color. Using the stirring stick, mix the epoxy for 15 to 30 seconds until it is a uniform white color. Spread all the epoxy across the entire substrate of the sensor. Include any tabs that have not been removed. Gently touch the sensor to the bottom edge of the joist, making sure you don't squeeze out all the epoxy. This is not like bonding two pieces of wood together. You do not want to clamp the sensor too tightly. You do want there to be a nice layer of epoxy to bond the sensor to the joist. Use a couple pieces of tape to hold the sensor in place while the epoxy cures. The tape can either be left or removed later. It will have no bearing on the performance of the sensor. This epoxy has a 5-minute work time, so the sensor must be mounted within this time frame. Depending on temperature, the epoxy should be fully cured in 24 hours. However, it should be hard enough for you to accurately walk test the system after 4 hours. Movement on the floor above will not affect the curing process. You should now have an understanding of the bottom mounting method for the Pulsar. The next segment will show how to side mount the Pulsar when the bottom mounting method cannot be used. Thank you for watching.